We know that 7th century Arabia was a very hierarchical society with elites. It was a tribal society. There were male heads of household. And while the Quran doesn't fully overturn those social structures, what it does do is it says that it doesn't matter where you sit within those hierarchical social structures for your salvation. And of course, in the Quran, the central thing is salvation. The central aim of this life is to get to the next life. And this life is construed as a test in which you're tested by your circumstances. I'm Karen Bauer. I'm Associate Professor in the Qur'anic Studies Unit of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and I'm here to talk to you about my recently co-authored book with Feras, Hamza, Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Qur'an, A Patronage of Piety.
My name is Feras Hamza. I am Senior Research Fellow at the Quranic Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I'm also head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Wollongong in Dubai.
We started out this project with thinking that we would do a chapter in our anthology on the subject of women in the Qur'an itself. And so we brought together all of the Qur'an's verses on women and started looking at that subject, and this project developed from that.
We realized how central women were in the Qur'an in a way that's not been traditionally, I think, appreciated, which is that traditionally, I think scholars have appreciated that women appear in the Qur'an, that there are laws regulating certain aspects of domestic life, conjugal life, and that women feature in them. And of course, there's a chapter entitled Women in the Qur'an, but I don't think anybody had put it together beyond that. And that, I think, had traditionally been a problem for, amongst others, feminists, Muslim feminists working in the field, trying to understand how to kind of understand the contemporary possibilities for women in the Muslim world on the basis of what the Quran says. And I think we try to go further than that. So we realized that women were as central as men, actually, to the salvific message of the Quran, and for what they what women could represent ultimately as kind of exemplars of piety. And so in that sense, I think our work goes further.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we point out is that, we're used to thinking in the modern period of gender as a modern question, but actually the subject of women, subjects like sexual morality, that's very central in the Quran and central to the identity of the emergent Muslim community as described in the Quran. And so one of our major contributions is to show that the centrality of the Quranic discourse on women to subjects that women had been excluded from in many previous works, subjects like prophetology, or subjects like theology, right? People wouldn't necessarily imagine that verses on divorce were anything to do with the Quran's theology. And yet, I think that we are able to show that these verses are central in that regard.
I think women opened up a series of other important kind of discoveries, really, once we realized how the verses on women, the way that they appear in the Quranic text and the way they constantly reappear, which we hadn't realized because we'd kind of worked, with a kind of sequential approach to the Quranic verses. But actually, when we realized how often women reappear and how close their appearance seems to be to the purpose of the moral message of the Quran, we actually then began to understand questions like, well, is there a difference between, like Karen said, laws that seem to be simply regulating life, social life, regular everyday, rules, social rules, and, theology, something, which is supposed to be much more about metaphysics and something much more highbrow. And we found actually that those two things were intimately, inextricably woven together. And so there is no useful way in saying the Quran has laws and has ethics, and these two things are separate. It has one message that kind of is refracted in what we would now in the modern day call laws and ethics. We would separate laws from morality. We would separate morality potentially even from ethics, but that's not something that the Quran does. So I think the topic of women gave us insight into far more about the nature of the Quranic text.
One thing that we did in this book is that we put salvation at the forefront of this book, because the Qur'an's salvific message is the core of the Qur'an. And so that is what our book revolves around. And by doing this, we were able to resolve some of the common issues that people have with the Qur'an, for instance, between its hierarchical elements and its egalitarian elements. And a part of how we resolved that is we showed how the Qur'anic message of salvation is grounded in the Qur'an's social milieu. And many people had known that, of course, the Qur'an presumes a certain social structure. It presumes male-headed households, and it presumes a social structure of patronage by which there would be a paterfamilias in a house, a male head of household, who would be patron for poor and disenfranchised people in the society. And this type of a social structure is common in societies where there's not a central government. And we know that 7th century Arabia was a tribal society without a central government. So therefore, the structure of society also structures morality in that society. And because the care of the vulnerable happen through these social structures rather than through a central government. So women become a prime example of vulnerable people who are cared for within those social structures of households and patronage.
And I think, just to build on that, once the Quran establishes its kind of ambition to recalibrate the role of the patron or the head of the household as a role of looking after vulnerable individuals, not just the women, but of course everybody else in the household, potentially orphans, slaves, hangers-on, elderly, dependents of all sorts. I think the really subtle move that is not appreciated the Quran makes is that once it speaks to those heads of households, the elites of the time, to say your duty is one of care, because what's involved in that care is potentially a mutual or reciprocal benefit, which is that of doing pious acts and kind of gaining in piety, which then has a reward in the hereafter. Then that becomes a paradigm for anybody. And so then anybody can become a patron of piety. And that's the effect of our, I guess, the subtitle of our book, Patronage of Piety. It's not supposed to be restricted to the male patrons of society, but because the Quran is historically situated, it speaks in the first instance to those patrons who are males and tries to kind of map out the system of how you become a patron of piety, which then allows everybody else to become involved in some sense. And that then actually brought in the other question of moral agency.
That's right. And I guess that what we could say is that in reformulating that patronage, God becomes the patron of all of the believers, and people accept God as their patron. And the opposite, of course, is that people could accept Satan as their patron and could follow that patronage. And the Quran makes the point again and again that actually those people who are bad in this life, who are immoral in this life, are the ones who on Judgment Day would end up finding themselves without any patron, because Satan would desert you, but God is the one thing that remains. And so essentially what people do is if God is the patron, then they're looking after the poor people, not for any recompense from those poor people, or the vulnerable, not for any recompense, the way that you would in a normal patronage situation. You would give out favors and expect something in return. But instead, what you do is you give your wealth for the sake of God, in order to serve God, for God's face. It says these in many different ways. And then that and there, by doing that, you're accepting the patronage of God, or you're asking for the patronage of God. He becomes the patron, and the recompense is in the next life. It's that actually you then are rewarded then in the next life. But what this has the effect of doing is that by understanding that salvation is the central thing, that the next life is the central thing in the Quran, it's not this life, then none of those worldly hierarchies, which actually persist to this very day in terms of wealth and poverty, and none of that is what truly matters for a person's soul. What truly matters for a person's soul is their good deeds. And so by looking at the subject of women, what we were able to do is show that through having absolutely equal moral agency, these people who are considered vulnerable in a patronage, male-dominated patronage society, actually have absolute egalitarianism in spiritual terms, and in terms of their access, their ability to be saved in the next life.
And the point, I think, about God being patron is really important, because it's throughout the Quran. God is, the root for patronage is walaya, and so the term mawla, which is familiar because it's probably anglicized in some sense. God is a mawla. So God is a patron. He is a Lord. It's not just rhetorical. God really means that this is his patronate that you enter into, as opposed to the patronate of evil, which is the immoral life and so on.
That's right. It's not at all just a rhetorical point about God being patron. It's about that notion of reciprocity, that you're no longer expecting reciprocity in this life for the good deeds that you do. You're expecting the reciprocity to come. And that's why the Quran says again and again, those who give in charity, they'll be rewarded double in the next life, right? And those who do good will be rewarded without any reckoning, right? And so it's that what you do in this life is rewarded manifold in the next life. And that's where you get the egalitarianism and in the text. And that's what's so interesting about it, because we might assume from a modern perspective that there can be no fairness or justice without social egalitarianism. And yet, if we look around ourselves, we know that our societies are anything but egalitarian. Try buying a property in London, for instance. We do not actually live in egalitarian societies even today. However, it can be easy to mistake what the Quran takes for granted, which is that 7th century Arabia is inegalitarian, for a promotion of inequality in society. And that's not at all what is going on. What's going on in that text is not promoting inequality in the world. It's promoting equality in salvation for the next life, and it's recognition that there is inequality in the world.
I think there is a tendency in contemporary thinking that for some reason in egalitarianism, the lack of equality for all somehow excuses individuals perhaps from being morally responsible, as though that if only we were all equal, we could then be better moral beings. And I think the Quran says, well, actually, the individual has free will and they have agency, even if they don't think that they have agency, even if they're in the most destitute of socioeconomic situations, there's always that moral agency of choosing the good, thinking of the good option, and so on. And I think that's an important point. We perhaps are more inclined to think of the importance of egalitarianism, because then it makes us kind of equal to be able to be empowered to then think about morality and ethics and law and everything else in that kind of categorized way. And I think the Quran is different from that. The other point I wanted to make is that one thing I always fear when we talk about the importance of the afterlife in the Quran is that it's unfortunately been, and we've seen that in the last, I guess, 2 decades mostly, is that this is misinterpreted as a kind of Muslim obsession with the afterlife at whatever cost. But the cost actually is very high and is very difficult, because it's about a very tasking exercise of disciplining the self, of becoming selfless in the fullest sense. And so it's about doing things for others, which doesn't come naturally, of course, and comes with, very difficult task. And I think it's not that Muslims are obsessed with the afterlife. I think the Quran is obsessed with making sure that this life produces the good enough works for people then to merit the afterlife.
So I think that one of the things that we'd like the reader to take away from this is that the saying that the Quran is situated in its historical context in late antiquity doesn't just mean that it's responding to Jewish and Christian doctrine. It means that its morality is socially contextualized. Its morality is contextualized within the social structures that had actually existed from antiquity onwards, with the paterfamilias and that male head of household paterfamilias, and the structures of patronage, and so those social structures are something that had existed for many centuries before the Quran. And so to what we notice in the Quran itself is that it is imposing a moral structure on those, so that the way that you behave, no matter where you are situated in the social hierarchy, is what leads to your salvation.
It sounds almost superfluous to say, but one ought to say it, how central women are to the moral purpose of the Quran, the moral message of the Quran, just because they are, they're men and women, and so both are complicit. And the Quran makes it very clear, actually, that they are allies of one another. So it speaks to them in those terms. The Quran says, "Awliya'ukum ba'dukum min ba'd." So it's trying to get them to understand each other as spiritual equals, and both morally responsible in this larger trajectory of working out a life of piety. And sowing the seeds of that piety wherever possible.
And so I think that another key takeaway is that actually certain things that might be taken for granted at the modern period as being certain doctrines that might be taken for granted as being potentially Qur'anic are actually not at all Qur'anic. What ends up happening is that because women and men have absolutely equal moral agency in the Quran, women have much more social agency than you would ever expect given the hierarchical society. For instance, Al-Mumtahana, that's a surah, it says that unbelieving women can leave their believing husbands and go off to the unbelievers without the husband's permission. Believing women can leave their unbelieving husbands and come to the believing community without their husband's permission. It's not as though women had to ask for their husband's permission to leave the house. Believing women are told to draw their cloaks around themselves when they leave the house. It's not as though women were kept in the house. And there's al-mujadila, which is when a woman and the prophet are alone in a room, and you know that they're alone because the Quran uses a dual form. That actually she's complaining about her husband and his unrighteous action towards her. He divorced her in a completely improper way. And God takes the woman's side on this, and the verses say that actually, she's it's the husband who's at fault here. And whereas in the modern period, you might expect the prophet to be told off for speaking alone in a room with a woman about her husband, with the husband not being present. No, that's not what's going on at all. In fact, what's going on is that the husband is being told off for treating his wife improperly. So women had a lot more social agency. And of course, the key point is when women and men are both told explicitly that they should command right and forbid wrong. And so this is actually a social duty. It's not something that only occurs within households, although later Islamic law did say that it was only a male duty. The Quran does not say that at all. In the Quran itself, it's women and men together who command right and forbid wrong, moral right and moral wrong in society. So women are actually pillars of the community in ways that, in very public ways, that you might not assume would be the case given a modern discourse, specifically a modern conservative discourse on women. In certain circles.
I think when you talk about things like morality and pious works, there's a danger of sounding wishy-washy, as if this is. But we must remember when the Quran means morality, it means in the social space. It's in other people's faces. I mean, it's in the public sphere. All pious works can only really, most pious works are in relationship to others. So this is something that's social. It's a social kind of dynamic. It's a social set of interactions. So in that sense, the Quran, is saying Quranic morality trumps social status. I mean, and that's why these women are allowed to kind of go off and make their own choices. So I think there's always a danger, when I was speaking about morality, to overlook the very real social settings in which this is happening, and hence the impact for social agency, the knock-on effect.
That's it. I think that, you can, we wouldn't want people to mistake us saying that there were male-headed households with a kind of ultimate male dominance, because it's quite the opposite. What the Quran ends up doing is telling off those male heads of household if they try to abuse their power. That is what's happening in those verses. It's not granting them some kind of ultimate ownership or power in their households. It's not doing that at all. What it's doing is saying, if you do not treat these people with respect, and if you do not treat them well and give them everything that they deserve, then actually it's your own salvation that's at stake there with that.
There's so many things that came out of this book. I think the major struggle, to be honest, is that we've tried to be as historical and as kind of scholarly as possible with the reading of the Quran in its own context, because we're very conscious that, Muslim societies have been constructed socially around the edifice of jurisprudence, which has been male dominated, and so has its own interpretation of what the Quran is saying and the impact of that for women's status. And so in a sense, it's really, we have our, it's a major challenge for us to, and in that sense, I understand the kind of the exasperation of, contemporary Muslim feminists trying to understand the Quran, because they can see that it's been refashioned through the jurisprudence and kind of has produced Muslim societies in the way that they are now. They're structured through jurisprudence, not through that original sense that the Quran, I think, comes to us as, and that's what we're trying to read. And that's it.
What we realized through our last book is that you cannot trust the interpretive tradition or the juridical tradition to give you the truth of what's actually happening in the Quranic text, because those texts of commentary and of jurisprudence through time were produced in their own societies, and the Quran predates all of that, and it has its own perspective that is not adequately represented at all, I would say, in the tradition of jurisprudence and exegesis or tafsir or.
So in that sense, I don't think the jurisprudence read the Quran historically at all.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, because you think of course they knew they would provide occasions for revelation, they would explain things through the tafsir works, but in that real sense, nobody ever did any history about the Quran, when they were constructing tafsir and jurisprudence. Of a different conception of what the Quran meant. I think they took it, as a purely kind of, theological, ahistorical text in some sense, and that's That's been a problem, I think, for jurisprudence.
We know that 7th century Arabia was a very hierarchical society with elites. It was a tribal society. There were male heads of household. And while the Quran doesn't fully overturn those social structures, what it does do is it says that it doesn't matter where you sit within those hierarchical social structures for your salvation. And of course, in the Quran, the central thing is salvation. The central aim of this life is to get to the next life. And this life is construed as a test in which you're tested by your circumstances. So the elites are tested by their elite circumstances to see whether they will end up in the afterlife, in the hereafter. And the non-elites, the vulnerable members of society, are also tested by their circumstances. It's because it's not your social status that ends up mattering for your salvation. It's the acts of piety that you undertake. That is what matters for a person's salvation in Quranic terms.
I think we hope mostly that our work is not misunderstood in the way that I think that the Quran has been misunderstood, and that's our intention by focusing on the social structures of 7th century Arabia is to show the Quran's historicity, in the sense that it is looking at a social structure in 7th century Arabia, but it's not validating it. It's not asking it to be, it's radically transforming the nature of that social structure, allowing it for then to become the springboard for a much broader emancipation of elements in society, amongst whom are, of course, women and others. And so when we speak about male-headed households, where we don't want at all to be misunderstood as somehow promoting Muslim conservatism, that would be a radical misunderstanding of our book. And it's actually a radical misunderstanding of the Quran. And so if you only understand from those social structures a replication of those social structures, then you've misunderstood the Qur'anic point, which is a radical transformation of those social structures into structures of piety. And piety is not gender specific.